Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a great day. I know I am. The newest book, before I go any further and talk about the passive voice, newest book is Shadow and Smoke. It's Moonsong Book 3. If you're watching this video right when it comes out, you can get the first two books in the Moonsong series, City of Silver and Tyrant's Gallow, for free on Amazon. I'm also going to run a couple free days, I think, next weekend. So if you miss out on that deal, just pay attention for, I think, Friday and Saturday of next week. I'll give some more free days for that, so people can get into the series. So you can grab that now. It just came out. It came out today. The passive voice is to be avoided. This is one of those pieces of writing advice that gets thrown around a lot by lots of different people. It's not just like, literature teachers or, writing gurus or something. You're going to hear this like, don't do the passive voice thing a lot. And I think it's one of those lessons that gets too absorbed, particularly by writers of fiction. And I want to talk about how you can actually use the passive voice appropriately and why you actually should use the passive voice if you're a fiction writer, and why the passive voice actually should be avoided, why it is to be avoided in certain kinds of writing, not usually when writing fiction, but rather when writing nonfiction of various kinds. So what is the passive voice? The passive voice is basically where you are removing a specific subject from a sentence. Shots could be heard. The sunrise could be seen. More dishes were brought out. Okay, so that's the passive voice. Versus a more traditional sentence where you have a subject who is doing something, a verb, acting on an object, right? So if you say, more plates were brought out, that's passive voice. Servants brought out more plates. So why would you want to use one versus the other? Well, the passive voice exists for a good reason, right? Nothing in language just exists because it's bad. So there's nothing in language, that includes adverbs, by the way, that's a whole nother video, but nothing in language exists for bad reasons. Rather, you can weaken your writing by using things in a less than appropriate manner, or let's say a suboptimal manner. So more plates were brought out. The emphasis is on the object of the action. The plates. What's important is that the plates were being brought out, right? Not who was bringing them. Servants brought out more plates. Now that's also correct. It's obviously a correct thing to say. Now, why would you want to remove the servants from this action? Well, the answer is because the servants aren't important. They're basically background. They're window dressing for whatever the scene is where servants are bringing out plates. Now, you can mention that servants are doing this, and then you may just want to kind of push the servants to the side. More plates were brought out. More wine was brought out. It could be there's no servants. The hosts are bringing out wine. The hosts brought up more wine. Maybe the guests brought up more wine. Does it really matter? More wine was brought out. So if you want to emphasize the action and not the subject, that's what you use it for. And the reason you wouldn't want to talk about the servants would be, what is it about these servants? Do I need to know more about them? They must be important because you're talking about them. Who are they? What do they look like? You may draw the reader's attention to what is really something completely unimportant in the story, which is that there are servants present and that they are doing things. Unless you want to talk about the servants and there's something special about them, you may just kind of want to push them to the side and use the passive voice. Another place that you might want to use the passive voice is whenever you have, say, a group of characters and something which is occurring that all of them will perceive in various amounts. Shots could be heard. Screams could be heard in the distance. That's passive voice. Now, you could say, they heard screams. That's obviously correct, and it totally works. They all heard screams. Well, the thing is, if you're describing a lot of things that they're all hearing, it can get a little bit cumbersome in a paragraph if you say, they all heard screams and shouting. They kept listening, and they heard this, and they heard that, and they heard, subject, predicate, this kind of like subject, verb, object, subject, verb, object. They heard this, they saw this, they. And then, of course, you probably, to replace that pronoun, you may have to use, a description, the party, the friends, right? Often when we're talking about indistinct groups of people, a party of adventurers, it's hard to come up with like a good word to describe them. The fellowship, right? So if we use the passive voice, we don't get bogged down into having a pronoun like they occur over and over again in quick succession. Rather, it breaks up the writing so that the flow of a paragraph has a couple of different sentence formats to it. This is a more advanced thing with style. It's not something that you need to worry about too much if you're just starting your journey as a writer and you are developing your style as you go. But it's something that you may pick up as you reread your work, is that if you have a lot of really simple sentence structures, they did this, it's good to break those up with other kinds of sentence structures that will just make the paragraph feel less like like a green text on 4chan or something like that, and will feel more, just have a little bit more fluidity to the prose. So yes, you can, and in fact should, use the passive voice to break up some of those flows, as long as you are not, and let's get to like the no-nos. What you don't want to use the passive voice to do is to purposefully obscure the subject in a way that's obvious to the reader, like you're trying to not tell the reader something that happened. So you can sometimes end up wanting to do this in a mystery. Shots could be heard, and you're not wanting to tell the reader who did it. Obviously, that's important, but there's probably other ways to do that. Harry stood up and he heard gunshots, right? So now we're a little bit more subject on we can focus on the subject and what he's actually perceiving, rather than pulling it away from his sensory perception and leading the reader to obviously know that you're disguising who's doing what in a particular scene. So as long as you're not doing something really obvious like that, then yeah, the passive voice is totally usable in fiction. All of the best writers that you read use the passive voice. All the classic writers use the passive voice in various places and for various reasons, some of the reasons that I talked about. Tolkien uses the passive voice very frequently because there's often many characters in an area doing something, and something will happen that they more or less all perceive. They could hear water tinkling. They could also say water could be heard tinkling, right? So it depends where you want to emphasize it. You want to emphasize the object, use the passive voice. If you want to obscure and just kind of take the focus away from the subject, that's when you're going to use the passive voice. Or, you are writing a paragraph of prose and you just want to, switch up the sentence structures a little bit, and it's not important, the subject that's doing something or the subject that's perceiving something, especially if you're doing something that involves perception. There's multiple people perceiving something. It's not that important that we point out exactly who's perceiving what at any given time in a scene. Now, there's some other cases where you probably don't want to use the passive voice, or maybe you do, depending on your goals. So that is with nonfiction writing, something like writing a newspaper article. This is something that you'll pick up a lot if you are aware of that passive voice, that removal of the subject from the statement, which makes things obscure and, obtuse. You don't know exactly what's happening. This is used a lot, actually, in the media to obscure what actually happened, to basically mislead the reader and make them think that events happen in a different way from the way that they did happen. And if you are very good at picking up on this, you'll start to realize just how manipulative most journalism is. It's mostly propaganda at this point, and even something that is just going to be trying to report the facts will often obscure the facts purposefully in order to lead the reader to an incorrect conclusion. Now, I've reported on some of these in the past in the channel. Those sorts of videos always get really no views. Like the algorithm does not like them. But you can look up, many, many different examples of this. I've used the New York Times, the paper of record, will do things like this. Use the passive voice. So let's say that there's, you're reporting on a shooting, right? Since we've done shots could be heard. How many times have you read shots were fired? Shots were fired by who? The gun went off. Now, that's not actually passive voice, but we're removing the subject. Whose gun did what? Shots were fired by whom? There was an altercation, shots were fired, then Michael was pronounced dead on the scene. Oh, we're missing some information there. Now, right there, you start to think, oh, well, obviously, whoever Michael was talking to fired the shots and Michael died. Now, it could be that Michael fired the shots, a ricochet bounced back and hit him in the head and killed him. But if you're just omitting those facts, then you can use things like the passive voice to just avoid saying what actually happened. And when you focus on the object like that and put it in the passive voice, it's like, well, it just happened. Shots were just fired. Then an accident just happened. This house was foreclosed on. Who foreclosed on it? Well, I don't know. It was just foreclosed on. Did a specific bank foreclose on the house? Somebody was arrested. Now, in that case, we know that a police officer arrested him, so it's not like completely wrong to say somebody was arrested. But the more correct way would be like officers arrested him. Sheriff's deputies arrested him. Things like that, rather than he was arrested or he was detained. Detained by whom, right? Shots were fired by whom? So this is something that you pick up in I would assume that you're taught not to use this, but journalists use it frequently because it's a good manipulative device. It's a way to very subtly make the reader believe something that is often the opposite of the truth. There's a couple examples I've gone through, but one was, I think, surrounding this. I think it was surrounding like the whole Covington thing, where they just stopped in the middle of an article and just started listing opinions of random people. This is an article supposedly reporting the facts. They just got some opinions from like some random people on the street in the middle of a newspaper article in the New York Times. I actually did the same thing with, I think this was the same video I did years ago. This thing where this guy was getting dragged off a Delta Airlines flight and like suffered these injuries. So this is what it was. Like, there's a passive voice. Injuries were suffered. Who did it? They avoided the entire time saying who did what. And so people came to believe that Delta Airlines pulled a guy off of the airplane. Like this doctor. They pulled him off the air. Turns out there was more to it than that. That Delta Airlines assaulted this person and injured him as they pulled him off the airline. Turns out it was the Chicago Airport Police that did it. But they were never mentioned in most of the articles. You had to go to the Chicago Tribune or like the Chicago Sun-Times, the papers that are from Chicago, to note that it was the Chicago Police Department, officers of the Chicago Airport Police, pulled this guy off of the flight after he refused to give up his seat for a pilot, because they had to take a pilot to another airport to fly a plane. And so they were trying to get him off the plane because they needed his seat. They had to kick him off to another flight so that they could give a seat to a pilot. I think they did it by lottery or something like that. I don't remember all the details of the story. But I do remember that these articles just avoided talking about who did it. And so people were like, Delta Airlines are evil. They're beating up old Asian grandpas and stuff. And it wasn't Delta Airlines that did it. Now, Delta Airlines asked the police officers to remove the person from their property, but it wasn't them who beat him up or hurt him in the process at all. Rather, it was these Chicago Airport Police, and there was a lot of contention surrounding the existence of this department in Chicago, which was different from the Chicago Police Department, and I think had some scandals associated with it. Now, that's years ago at this point, but it was just an example that really stuck with me because everybody had the same opinion about Delta Airlines, and you went and looked at it, and it's like, wow, the facts are completely different once you go look at a paper that didn't do this stuff that I'm talking about, like use the passive voice to avoid saying who did what. It's a manipulative tactic. And it's the same thing. If you're writing with the passive voice in like a scientific paper, that's probably not going to be the best thing. Like if you're listing your observations, you wouldn't say, this was observed. You could say that if you don't want to say like what researcher observed it, but you want to say like we observed this. a researcher observed this. You want to say that an individual or multiple people observed it. You want to be really clear with every single kind of action that happens in a formal paper like that versus something that is supposed to be creative like fiction. So anyway, that's the passive voice. People tend to take it way too seriously about avoid the passive voice. It's okay to use the passive voice sometimes. That's why it exists. It's for emphasizing the object rather than the subject. So that's all I wanted to talk about. Shadow and Smoke, you can get it right now. Boom. It's out right now. Okay. And you can get the whole trilogy, including the first 2 books, might be free if you're watching this video right when it comes out. That's about it. You leave me your thoughts down below on the passive voice. I'll do another video on adverbs, because adverbs are another one of these things where you're like, adverbs are always bad. Why do we have them then? Well, we have them for good reasons, but it's one of those pieces of advice that on the surface level, yeah, you take it. Oh, well, yeah, passive voice is to be avoided. Adverbs are bad, but all the best writers that you have probably enjoyed reading use both of those things. So anyway, guys, I'll see you next time.